Hello, I'm Sami Zaidan and welcome to Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, things to watch in 2019. Financial storms could be forming in the global economy. Find out why and where. What's in store for economies and people living here in the oil-dependent Middle East? Plus, a look at what economic collapse means for Venezuelans in the new year. When America sneezes, the world catches a cold, so the saying goes. When there's a perceived weakness in the world's biggest economy, there's a ripple effect elsewhere. Now, as we're headed into the new year, global financial markets felt a chill, all on concerns over the health of the US economy. The Dow Jones Industrial Average saw its worst Christmas Eve trading day in history. Even though economic fundamentals like GDP are still pointing to the upside, there's a cocktail of factors flashing a pessimistic message. The US government partial shutdown, higher US interest rates, and Donald Trump's tweets criticizing the central bank. Then there's the rumbling trade tensions with China, which threaten to derail growth. And that's where I started when I caught up with Russell Jones from Llewellyn Consulting as the year wrapped up.
I don't expect there to be any major retreat from the sort of protectionism or mercantilist policies that the US president is pursuing. So any truce, I think, is likely to be only short-lived. And it really is a concern that over the next year or two, we see the protectionist rhetoric and the protectionist substance really be ratcheted up to a higher level. It's one of the bigger risks for the global economy looking into the next 12 months or so.
Regardless of what happens on that, the US economy does still have its weak spots. That is giving some worry. Is the US, do you think, heading towards a recession?
I think the US is in what I call an unsustainable boom at the moment. We've had this very late cycle fiscal stimulus, and that, if you like, has hothoused economic activity during the course of the last 12 months or so. But that stimulus is going to start to fade. And the legacy of that stimulus is two very large deficits, a very large budget deficit and a very large external deficit. The tariffs that Mr. Trump is imposing on imports will not change that fact. The US is consuming far more than it's producing, and at the moment, that means that the trade deficit will expand. And in many ways, the US economy right now is looking similar to the way it did in the mid-1980s during the period of Reaganomics. That was another era of twin deficits, and it was another era that ended rather badly. It was a period of extreme volatility in financial markets and also in policy making. So my concern is that the US looks good for now, but that the situation over the course of the next year or so is going to deteriorate quite rapidly and potentially traumatically so. The US is heading for a fall. It may not be imminent, but it's coming at some stage.
What about China's debt and growth challenges? Where do you think those are heading in 2019?
Well, China is in a very, very difficult situation at the moment. The economy is slowing down at an underlying level. And at the same time, we have a corporate sector which is still hugely indebted, and we have issues of transparency around the economy. This is generating a lot of uncertainty where foreign investors are concerned. And of course, on top of that, we have the growing protectionist issues which it faces as a result of US trade policy. So China's in a tough place. Also, in addition, we have a number of underlying tensions in the Chinese economy which have been around for a long time. Tensions between a capitalist economy and a communist government, tensions between the economy's economic growth and the underlying environmental problems it has, tensions between the rural areas and the urban areas, tensions between the rich and the poor. And at some stage, my sense is that all of these issues are going to result in a crisis of some kind. Unfortunately, I don't feel smart enough to tell you precisely when that's going to happen. But when you have this number of issues coming together at the same time, it is pretty clear that at some juncture in the future, the economy is going to get into trouble. It's going to suffer some kind of traumatic experience. Policymakers also are finding it much harder in China to navigate their way through this series of issues that they're confronting. Sort of slamming their foot on the accelerator and then slamming their foot on the brake is an approach which has worked thus far, but there is a sense that it's generating deteriorating returns. It's just not as efficient approach in managing the economy as it has been in the past. And that's another reason why I fear that at some stage they're going to get into trouble.
Let's turn our attention to Europe then, from Brexit to the protests facing the French president to Angela Merkel's departure from Germany. A lot of political uncertainty. How do you think that's going to impact the continent's economy in 2019?
Well, we're already seeing indicators of business confidence soften quite significantly in the Eurozone. And there's no doubt that trade and politics are probably the two primary drivers of that softening of confidence. And I think the outlook is a little bit worrying. The economy in Europe is losing momentum, and there's no sign that the sort of upsurge in populist politics is going to go away anytime soon. Brexit is another issue. It's probably going to be a lot more damaging for the United Kingdom than it is for Europe, but nevertheless it is just one more consideration, one more concern. And I think beneath the surface as well with Europe, the fact is that the Eurozone remains what I call a rather half-baked entity. A lot of its institutions are incomplete, and my real concern is that when the next recession does come round, Europe could once again see itself facing a sort of existential crisis, very much along the lines that we saw between 2010 and 2013.
Is there any upside at all that we could perhaps take hope from for 2019?
Well, the good news is that the world economy is still expanding at the moment. There's no doubt about that. But, you know, underneath the surface, all these issues will have to be addressed at some stage. The risks are many and various, and I certainly take the view that markets at the moment haven't quite taken on board all of those downside threats. There has been some adjustment since September or so, but there is, I think, the potential for markets everywhere to fall further. And I come back to this point that we are facing the great politicization. Ben Bernanke, the former Federal Reserve Chair, called the period in the 1990s and early 2000s the great moderation. This is the great politicization, and it makes it extremely difficult to know what is going to happen in the world economy. But what we do know from history
it sounds like you're predicting the next financial
crisis.
crisis. If so, when's it going to hit? Let us be ready for it then, shall we?
I'm not smart enough to tell you when the next financial crisis is going to come, but what I am, I think, clever enough or cognizant enough of history to know is that populism doesn't tend to end well. What I know from my experience is that bad policy leads to a bad outcome. And in the context of populism, we are going to be confronted, I believe, by a lot of bad policy choices. A lot of nativism, a lot of interventions which perhaps aren't necessary, a lot of wrong turnings. And I think that is, again, something which leaves us in a very dangerous, very threatened situation.
All right, thanks so much for your analysis on that. Russell Jones there, giving us his thoughts on the outlook for the year ahead. Well, still to come on Counting the Cost, microchipping employees. Is it ethical? Would you volunteer? And why some companies are already doing it. But first, nearly 2,000 Venezuelans cross the border into Peru every day, and that's likely to continue into the new year. After Colombia, Peru now hosts more Venezuelans trying to escape economic hardship than any other country. Mariana Sanchez has been following their stories from Lima.
Amelis Caraballo has been selling coffee on the streets of Lima since she arrived from Venezuela in November. The 32-year-old is qualified in food quality control, but she's afraid she'll get in trouble for trying to work in an industry she knows well. She missed the October deadline to apply for a work permit by just a few weeks.
I'm afraid. We came here to work legally and to be in the country legally. I don't want to do anything against the law.
Peru's so-called foreign police, along with immigration officials, are conducting inspections across the capital to ensure Venezuelans have the required permits to work. Immigration chief Roxana del Águila said they briefly detained some Venezuelans for security reasons.
Sadly, some people have committed crimes, and that makes us sad because it affects the way Peruvians see them, and it also makes Peruvians afraid.
At the immigration office in Lima, many are rushing to apply for work permits before yet another deadline, December 31st. Peru says it won't issue any more after that.
I haven't waited for the last minute, but it's been very difficult because I still don't have a certificate from Interpol.
Immigration authorities say they've increased the number of personnel and office hours to help these Venezuelans get their paperwork done fast. But they also say 85,000 Venezuelans have missed their appointments and 20,000 have not picked up their approved permits. 635,000 Venezuelans now live in Peru, according to official estimates. Alejandra Bolívar says she feels lucky that she crossed the border in time to work legally.
I applied in August. They gave me the appointment just now. But I don't know what will happen to those who get here after. The situation in Venezuela is a tragedy.
Officials say those who entered after October can only apply for asylum now. But Amelis Caraballo says this doesn't guarantee a job.
I applied for asylum. They gave me a paper that allows me to work, but no one is accepting it as valid.
On average, 2,000 Venezuelans cross into Peru every day. Peruvian officials say they will not issue work permits after December, but for now they will keep the border open to those fleeing the deepening economic and political crisis back home.
Now, crude oil fell almost 25% in 2018, and for petro-dependent economies here in the Gulf, that's not welcome news. Over the year to come, government budgets may have to make some adjustments. Iran, for example, already feeling the pain after being hit by US sanctions on its oil industry. The latest government spending plan shows revenues are down sharply. As inflation soars, the government is promising to meet people's basic needs. Across the wider region, a growing youth population needs stronger economic growth to create jobs. Diversification away from oil is a big part of that. Let's get more now on the outlook for the Middle East region's economy in the year ahead. I'm joined by Laurent Lambert, a senior policy analyst at the Social and Economic Survey Research Institute at Qatar University. Welcome back. Good to have you in the studio again. So are people in the region heading towards better economic times in 2019, would you say, Laurent?
Well, not so much. Actually, what most people expect is a tougher 2019, actually. The prices of oil are not expected to be very high, and the prices of gas are expected not to be at the high level they've been during 2018. So not a very good situation for the Middle East region, generally speaking.
No expectation that OPEC will make further production cuts and that will stabilize oil prices, at least from falling further?
So there are two things here. There is OPEC and OPEC plus. OPEC is the traditional OPEC. OPEC plus is when Russia and some other countries may join in the effort to make further cuts and to influence the price of oil up, to have a higher price of crude. The problem is that Russia, which is the key player outside of OPEC, but joining in OPEC plus, does not have much interest in making so many cuts. It has agreed on one not so long ago. It didn't have much influence. I don't expect them to make a strong cut in 2019.
Last time you came in, we talked about diversification, though, that these economies are supposed to be heading towards more sort of knowledge-based economies. Where did that go then?
Well, unfortunately, due to lower oil prices, which is the key commodity for most of the oil exporting countries of the region, for most of the countries of the Arabian Peninsula especially, but also in northern Africa.
So they didn't hit their targets?
No, not at all. They are far below, and it's not the first year.
If the region's economies haven't been able to perhaps invest as much in knowledge-based economic plans, I guess there's no fallback position in terms of if oil prices are weak, that they have something else to look towards to generate income.
Yes, indeed. There is a strong concern here that they are still heavily reliant on this one commodity that they don't control so much. The old good time where OPEC could make a difference are gone. Everyone agrees on that. Now we see that OPEC Plus is not that strong. So this diversification that they tried to implement through ground infrastructure projects, development of more a knowledge-based economy are significantly delayed. Saudi Arabia, for instance, has changed its targets. And for now, we see that 2019 won't be that much different than in 2018, but it will only make this diversification postpone even further.
You mentioned Saudi Arabia, one of the Gulf economic heavyweights. Its assets came under pressure in 2018, didn't it?
Yes, they did, for a number of reasons. There were some oil concerns, of course, as we've mentioned. The price of oil has decreased, but there were also some more political factors.
The Khashoggi affair.
The Khashoggi affair, the war in Yemen, which finally came to the attention of political decision makers in America, but also across Europe and some other countries, and some of the spat with former trade partners, if I may say, of Saudi Arabia, such as Canada, for a short time with Germany. So a set of elements which have been affecting very negatively the economic expansion of the Saudi economy.
Do you think that will continue in 2019?
Well, I don't expect such a series of bad news happening to Saudi Arabia because that has been quite exceptional. But what we unfortunately can expect is that the high levels of investment into the Saudi economy that they were expecting will not happen either, because people are scared. For now, people in the West, they are in a wait-and-see situation. They want to see what's happening if there is some more calm, if there is an economic growth, and then they may invest.
But it hasn't been all wait and see in the Gulf, right? Because Qatar, on the other hand, seems to be defying expectations in terms of attracting capital, given that there's no end in sight that we can see to the blockade. Its assets were the best performing in the region, right?
Yes, but Qatar, as you've said, is a very different situation. Qatar is mostly a gas exporting country. It's not so much relying on oil. And gas really outperformed in terms of the growth oil. There is not the same kind of competition on the international market for outlets for natural gas than there is for oil. Oil has seen a surge from North America, essentially from the US and especially from Texas, which has been extraordinary over the past year. In gas, this has happened. There has been a growth in Australia especially, but this was not to the same extent. And also there is one key element, is that China now is shifting more towards imports of natural gas than other sources of combustion. So it's trying to reduce its use of coal and its use of oil, if it can. It's difficult, but at least they try to have their growth in energy demand compensated with increased amounts of natural gas. So this is driving this huge need for natural gas, driving the prices up. So Qatar is benefiting from this shift in the Chinese economy, while Saudi Arabia is suffering from a number of elements, including lower oil prices.
The gas versus oil, that's an interesting dynamic. Where does that leave a country like Iran? Is it heading towards more recession in 2019 because of the reimposition of US sanctions?
Well, this is what most people expect indeed. The reason is that although Iran has a lot of gas reserves, it actually does not exploit it or sell it abroad so much. Gas reserves need a lot of infrastructure investment to be able to be used commercially.
Which is difficult to get when you're under sanctions.
Absolutely. And so now for 2 decades, the Iranians have tried to develop their natural gas sector, but they've not managed to make very significant development of their capacities. So they are heavily reliant on oil, and oil, as I've just said, is not expecting to grow much higher. Actually, it has decreased a lot in 2018, and people think it will remain under the $60 level most of 2019, which is too low for the Iranian budget.
And finally, on the global economic outlook, if that slows down, as some are expecting, where does that, I don't want to make the picture even bleaker, but where does it leave the region?
Well, the region indeed is very much depending, structurally depending, on the global demand for energy, which is completely related to the global economic growth. If there is this stagflation that many fear may happen, well, then indeed it will negatively affect some oil and gas exporting countries of the Middle East. Some more than others. Again, Iran may be very severely affected, Saudi Arabia too. Gas countries such as Qatar, less so, but still, all will feel the impact of a global recession or global stagflation, which is what is most expected by many.
Laurent, good to have you with us. Thanks so much for coming in.
Thanks, Sammy. Good to be here.
Well, Saudi Arabia announced a major cabinet shake-up as the year came to an end. Significant changes include the appointment of former Finance Minister Ibrahim Al-Assaf to the post of Foreign Minister. Assaf was briefly detained during Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's anti-corruption crackdown last year. There's also a new national security advisor, but the Crown Prince retains his wide-ranging powers over the economy. The reshuffle is the first shake-up of the kingdom's power structures since the killing of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. And finally, microchipping your pet is a good idea if they tend to roam away from home. But what if your employer wants to do the same thing? Several British companies are considering offering tiny microchip implants similar to those for pets, but for their employees. It's voluntary, of course, but as Niamh Barker reports, there are concerns the risks may outweigh the benefits.
The future is a wave of a hand away. In case you missed it, here it is again. This is a whole new level of security. No keys or access cards, difficult to steal and copy, but the technology requires a certain level of commitment that's not for the faint-hearted. So this is where the microchip implant story begins, for those who want them at least. A clinical setting, a sterile environment, with some rather daunting bits of medical kit. So talk us through what happens next.
So the first part of the procedure is local anaesthetic is applied, so just your hand there. Then we'll use a scalpel just to make a small incision just there. And then finally it's the rather large needle applicator, and that will be pushed just.
I'll stop you there. For me, in my case at least, I think everyone really wants to know is, does it really hurt?
Completely pain-free.
The UK firm Biotech offers implants to businesses and individuals. It's fitted 150 implants to the UK so far, and the number's rising.
Assistive technology for disabled people, we implant. Banking, security, general users, so contactless payments, passport data, all could be stored on these microchips and embedded in your hand. Comes down to convenience, I suppose, for a lot of people. It's very hard to lose your hand. It's easy to lose your keys, your wallet, so a lot of certain demographics want that convenience.
This is one of several implant firms reportedly in discussions with British financial and legal companies. The names of the companies are being closely guarded. This isn't new technology. Microchips have been implanted in pets for many years, but the prospect of implanting them in employees has sparked concerns from trade unions.
Microchipping gives even more control and power to the employer, and that comes with inherent risks and dangers. Those risks and dangers shouldn't just be ignored by an employer. They need to take those into consideration, and they definitely shouldn't be pressuring any workers into being microchipped.
Biotech companies say the technology should be voluntary and that people must have a right to privacy. But with one Swedish firm, Biohacks, claiming to have already implanted 4,000 people, there are worries microchipping could eventually become the new normal. Societies embrace the mobile phone, making us easy to track on a daily basis. But by implanting microchips, there may be few places left to truly escape from technology.
And that's our show for this week. But remember, you can get in touch with us via Twitter. Use the hashtag AJCTC when you do. or drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. There's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. That's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Sami Zaidan from the whole team here. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.